Good afternoon, everyone. We are here today with a really special panel on women in the prison system. This is a panel part of the Second International Symposium on Gender and Prison Culture. Welcome, everyone. Today, we have at least 7 amazing presentations on women in the prison system. We will start very soon. I just want to give some information on how this will proceed. So we will have 2 to 3 presentations. And then after those presentations, we will open to a discussion. So if you have, so for everyone that is listening to us out there, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, please do so on the comment session, on the comments online, and we will gladly answer to your comments and your questions when the discussion is opened. We will start the presentation with Dina Veloso, with a presentation on living with the death sentence, the experiences of women formerly on death row in the Philippines. Okay, so welcome everyone. Dina, you have 15 minutes to present. Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening from the Philippines. I just wanted to, can you hear me? Okay, so my name is Dina Veloso, and I'll be presenting my research on women formerly on death row in the Philippines. Okay, so for my research questions, I had 3 research questions that I wanted to answer in my study. The first question is, what were the circumstances that led to the incarceration and sentencing of women formerly on death row in the Philippines? I also wanted to examine how these women's incarceration and sentences affected their families, particularly their children and other significant relationships. And I also wanted to look into how the suspension of the death penalty in the Philippines and the consequent commutation of the women's sentences to life imprisonment without parole affected their incarceration and their situation as women formerly on death row. I particularly looked into how these women formerly on death row viewed their current situation as inmates on life situation, their issues and concerns as they continue to face long-term imprisonment. For my research methods, I engaged in participant observation at the 2 existing women's prisons in the Philippines. I also conducted in-depth interviews with 27 women formerly on death row, 9 family members of these women, and 8 prison staff. And I also engaged in document analysis of prison rules and regulations, as well as other reports on the death penalty in the Philippines, as well as the justice system in general. For my research sites, I conducted extensive ethnographic research at the main women's prison in Metro Manila, the capital of the Philippines. Correctional Institution for Women is its name. And I also did research at at the time, it was the newly opened women's prison in the southern Philippines called Correctional Institution for Women in Mindanao. Okay, these are some photos of the prison in Manila and in Mindanao, as well as some of the women in my study. So for my theoretical approach, I looked into Goffman's concept of career, which he defines as any social strand of any person's course through life. In particular, I looked at the pre-incarceration period of the women's lives and the in-prison period of their lives, which I divided into their experiences on death row, as well as after the abolition or suspension of the death penalty. I also examined how Daly's pathways to felony court apply to the situation of the women, as Daly highlighted the role of survival, resistance to crime, and economic or physical victimization as the main causes of law breaking among women. However, when I found her pathways to felony court a bit limited as far as the situation of the women was concerned, I also examined the application of Ritchie's gender entrapment theory in terms of how it informed women's involvement in illegal activity due to violence, coercion, and other constraints in intimate relationships. Okay, so what brings like in terms of the women's oops, I skipped through a slide. In terms of the women's situation, the literature shows that incarcerated women have historically been invisible in research and public discourse on crime and criminal justice. And while feminist research has grown regarding the role of gender in the creation and response to crime, with gender being defined as the social and cultural construction of behaviors, roles, and identities associated with masculinity and femininity, there remains the persisting invisibility of women, especially from non-Western developing nations, in mainstream criminology and criminal justice literature. And women on death row are a minority within a minority. They're even more invisible in research literature, in that there's limited research on the experiences of women on death row in general. And this applies to the situation of incarcerated women in general in the Philippines. Women on death row made up a smaller proportion of the death row population when capital punishment still existed. So oftentimes their issues and concerns were overlooked, trivialized, and lumped under those of men on death row. And after the suspension of capital punishment, there have been only 2 follow-up studies or reports, including my own research. Okay. In terms of the women, the background of the women in my study, the median age when I did my research was, as of 2009, 38 years old. And their median age during incarceration was 29 years old. The women are also predominantly from low-income backgrounds and ethno-linguistic minority groups in the Philippines, with limited education, disruptions in their lives, and unemployment, and many live children as adults or both. And the majority, 21 out of 27 of the women in my study, are mothers, often with very young children, of whom they were the primary caregivers before they landed in prison. In terms of their offenses, 13 women were convicted of kidnapping-related crimes, 9 of drug-related offenses, and 4 women of violent crimes such as murder-related offenses. In particular, 2 women were convicted of parricide. This is the term used for killing one's spouse or parent. And then, well, in their case, it was a current or estranged spouse. 1 woman was convicted of murder, another of carjacking with murder, and 1 woman was convicted of arson with homicide. That said, the women had limited criminal histories and only one had a pending case in addition to the crime of which she was convicted. And all but 5 women were identified as the accomplices rather than the masterminds of their crimes. And oftentimes, their co-accused they were co-accused parties in terms of their involvement in their crimes for 24 out of the 27 of the women informants. And they were related to their co-defendants in multiple ways, such as these parties were their co-accused parties were their partners, children, siblings, relatives, in-laws, friends, acquaintances, and for others, even people they had only met during their arrest. In terms of their pathways to prison and death row, for 3 women, it was direct or symbolic retaliation for ongoing or past abuse and victimization. For 4 women, it was hard living and economic need. For 3 women, it was substance abuse issues that brought them to prison and death row. And for the vast majority of the women in my study, it was mainly deception and betrayal in relationships. Only 10 women admitted that they were guilty of the crimes of which they were convicted, and the rest insisted that they were innocent. For those who had landed in prison due to direct or symbolic retaliation for ongoing or past abuse, one was a battered wife who killed her husband in self-defense. Another killed her ex-husband after her son was abused by his relatives, in a sense of grasping for grassroots justice. And another woman carried out her revenge by killing her husband crime due to trauma from her past, killing her father due to experience of hard living, which Howell defines as a perspective centered on the problems of daily living and personal relationships. And this they also invoked Philippine cultural values, such as we call it debt of gratitude or indebtedness, and cooperation to ensure smooth interpersonal relations. These also played a part in their compliance or cooperation with kidnapping-related offenses, while other women cited economic motives for drug-related crimes. For other women, their drug addiction directly led to their involvement in drug trafficking. And for another, it was her one-time experimentation with drugs that led her to commit arson with murder. But the common denominator in their stories was that their partners and their friends played a role in their introduction into drug use and involvement in the drug economy. For the majority of the women, it was guilt by association that led to their criminalization, in that they were implicated in the offenses of significant networks, such as partners, family members, friends, or acquaintances. And it was quite common for them to talk about being duped into engaging in illegal activity or being framed or set up to take the blame for other people's crimes. Also, in terms of their reactions when they were sentenced to death, the majority of the women are mothers, often with very young children, of whom they were the primary caregivers. And they commonly expressed concerns about the welfare of their children, as well as other family members, when they were convicted of their crimes and sentenced to death. It was common for some to actually withhold information about their incarceration or their death sentence, and others appropriated religious beliefs to cope with their long-term separation from their children and or to comfort their children. And for others, they also, as maybe as a coping mechanism, adopted a more dismissive or nonchalant attitude towards their sentence in order to spare their children and or other family members from anguish. Oops, what just happened? Okay, and then in terms of their experiences when they were brought to prison, so Goffman defines a total institution as a facility that limits and controls all aspects of people's activities, movements, and interactions. And the turning point in the women's incarceration careers was their transfer from jail while they were awaiting sentencing to their arrival in prison, or from one total institution, like one prison to another, one prison in Manila to the prison in the south. In prison, compared to jail, they said they were exposed to restrictive, punitive conditions at their jails of origin. But in prison, they felt this was the real inmate life, in the sense of complete control and limited contact with the outside world. And they had mixed feelings and reactions throughout the process of being delivered, the term that they use for being transferred from jail to prison, or from prison to prison. They experienced fear, suicidal thoughts, regret, grief, resilience, fatalism, and passivity, as illustrated in their stories. Some talked about the support of family members and their optimism due to the presence of other co-accused parties. The women also had mixed experiences with jail guards and prison staff upon their transfer to the correctional institution for women. For some, their interactions were rather unpleasant or strained, in that the jail guards and prison staff used scare tactics regarding execution and rape in prison. Others, meanwhile, talked about more friendly or cooperative relations with guards and corrections officers. These are just some quotes about the women's delivery and arrival stories in prison. So one woman felt suicidal, another was really scared after a prison guard scared her about being raped by another woman inmate in prison, and another talked about how prison staff actually comforted her and said she wouldn't be executed. Okay. The women also experienced more stringent rules and boundaries when they were committed to the correctional institution for women. They spoke of so-called degradation ceremonies like fingerprinting, picture taking for their prison ID. They were assigned a prison number. They had to wear the prison garb, which they call a tangerine dress, to signify that their new status as inmates. Okay. And then also, they experienced like routine inspection of their belongings for contraband items, and they underwent medical examinations and interviews with prison staff, such as the social welfare officer, the psychologist, education coordinator, and the religious officer. Those who had spent more time on death row experienced more rigorous committal experiences. Like they spent up to 2 months in quarantine at the new arrivals unit before proceeding to death row. And from 1999 to 2006, in contrast, like the women went straight to what they called ISO, or isolation, the isolation unit or the death row dorm, upon their arrival at the correctional institution for women. In terms of their adjustment to their life on death row, for a lot of the women, they talked about the sense of fear, helplessness, vulnerability, and loneliness upon entering death row. For a lot of them, what added to their vulnerability was, for those who had been on death row longer, they stayed in a segregation unit that also doubled up as in a dorm that doubled up as a segregation unit for inmates with disciplinary issues and an isolation unit for inmates with contagious diseases. But they also spoke of moments of camaraderie and solidarity with fellow death row inmates. Those who had spent more time on death row reached out to the newer inmates. But at the same time, the women had to adjust to the implications of dealing with new people. They spoke of, the pressure of, in Filipino, we call it cooperation and compliance to ensure smooth social relationships. So they were pressured to get along with other women inmates with whom they shared a dormitory. And there were definitely power struggles between those who had been around longer and the newly arrived inmates. Very superficial matters like cosmetics, bunk beds, common space between their beds became sites of contestation, and fights broke out over these issues. Okay. But so like this is a quote from a woman who cried for 3 nights in a row because she couldn't sleep ever since she was sentenced, and an older inmate comforted her and said she wouldn't be executed. She didn't know that that inmate was also on death row, but when she found out that they were serving the same type of sentence, she felt more appeased. Another woman talked about how she was bullied by a more senior woman inmate on death row who picked a fight with her over things like the smell of her cologne, space between their beds, and so on. Okay. The women's narratives also reflect the process of prisonization, which is defined as how individuals internalize the norms and the subculture of prisons. The women internalized multiple forms of gendered social control in prison, like taking on an inmate identity, acquiring like new vocabulary at the women's prison, working, sleeping, taking on these new habits of eating, dressing, working, sleeping, and the like, appropriating prison jargon, making sense of the organizational structure and social order of the prison, and still looking for a reliable source of income and resources despite the constraints in the prison economy. The women also negotiated the inmate code, which involved minding their own business, being selective in their interactions and even friendships with fellow inmates, finding support systems in prison, like a prison family, but keeping more serious issues to themselves because they didn't want to burden other inmates. They also had to avoid fights as well as to avoid taking on debts because this became a serious cause of fights among the women. And the women's stories reflected how they internalized the dynamics of prison culture, like hierarchies among women inmates and even what's called prison politics. Okay. Living under the sentence of death for them gave them a sense of pervasive fears and powerlessness, especially for those who were facing death. The women felt heightened fears after the execution of a man in 1999 and the subsequent executions of other men on death row. And when they received the results of their appeals, which stated that they had been affirmed, this meant their sentences were confirmed and they were one step closer to death. One woman I interviewed was nearly executed, and she nearly became the first woman to be executed in Philippine history. But then her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment at the last minute. The other women, in their stories, expressed their sense of agency rather, in delaying her execution. Like they would make her sick on purpose, so she would die early, or they would of pervasive anxiety. But while there was also a lot of stigmatization towards death row inmates, they also experienced empathy within the prison community, and some utilized humor as a coping mechanism. um, when one woman was nearly executed, the other women talked about how they staged prayer vigils and so on, she also was monitored in terms
I think we're having some technical problems. Diana, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Okay. Well, you have to finish as soon as you can.
Okay, I'm almost done. The women experienced mixed responses about the abolition of capital punishment. Some were confused about the terms of their new sentence of life imprisonment without parole. Others actually wanted to keep the death penalty for sex offenders. And the women experienced fears about the reinstatement of capital punishment before the national elections and even at this time under the current president. They also experienced the lack of communication or strained ties with family members, economic concerns ongoing regarding their survival in prison, and the ordeal of facing long-term sentences. So at this time, as the women continue to serve, most of the women in my study are still in prison, and they experience the ordeal of not knowing when they will be released from prison. One woman said it's like there's still no chance of life, just the same, because they don't have any consistent chance of going home, given that they're still on life with imprisonment without parole. Another woman mentioned, she thinks about it every night, when she'll be released, when she'll be freed. She's still waiting. But if it's not her time, it's not her time. But she hasn't gotten tired of waiting. In conclusion, the women's narratives of how they ended up in prison and their lives on death row reflect what was central in their understanding of their identity, social worlds, and crimes. They exercised agency in illegal activity in response to cultural pressures to support themselves and significant networks in a society that gave them limited choices and were criminalized for entrenched inequality in the process. The claims of other women of being set up or dragged into the crimes of their significant networks resonate with culturally defined gender roles and behaviors like morality, passivity, and relationship-centeredness. Their accounts of deception and betrayal in relationships or institutions absolve them of an entrapment in illegal activity, police brutality and ill treatment, wrongful conviction due to poverty, racism, or politicking, and delayed justice are scripts that mirror larger realities in the Philippines. They also exercise limited agency in trying to postpone their executions and persisting helplessness in serving their long-term sentences. Thank you.
Oops. Thank you so much, Diana, for your excellent presentation. We sure learned a lot about the experience of women on death row in the Philippines. We will continue on the topic of death penalty, and we will hear now Cristiano.
Yes, I'm
here. We will now hear Cristiano talking about how strong is the light at the end of the path to abolish the death penalty for women in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay? I just would like to say that I'm a lawyer, so I'm sorry if I have to cite some judgment or some convention, yeah? So I hope that you won't be...
I don't see any problem on that.
Okay. No, because sometimes, people, they can be a bit bored, and I understand, but that's what I'm doing, so. Over here, after the election of Nelson Mandela as the president of South Africa, South Africa ended its death penalty with this very important judgment in it's called Makwanye and another. It was pronounced by the Constitutional Court in 1995 in June. That ruling indicated a momentous shift in the use of capital punishment in Africa, not only in South Africa, because, as you may know, South Africa has always acted as a magnet for the entire continent. As more countries joined the global trend to move away from death penalty. In December 2014, the UN General Assembly, 27 African countries voted in favor of a resolution calling for a progressive end to the use of the death penalty. 5 months earlier, in July 2014, in Cotonou, is in Benin, is in Northwest Africa, the continent had adopted a declaration urging countries still imposing death penalty to, I'm quoting it, consider abolishing the death penalty statutorily or constitutionally. For example, Namibia, that has been one of the countries with the best record of democracy in Africa after, of course, the end of colonization, made the death penalty unconstitutional since 1990. Afterwards, people can say why, as I said, the pronunciation of the court in South Africa is 1995, but of course, what happened in South Africa was more advertised than what was happening in Namibia. That's why the judgment in South Africa had many more repercussions in the world than the decision taken in Namibia. But Namibia, since 1990, had abolished the death penalty in its constitution. Limited attention is paid to women on death row in Africa, particularly as they make up a tiny percentage of the overall prison population. In 2019, estimated 500 women are on death row worldwide. Female inmates represent approximately the 15% of the death row in Malawi, 4 women, 5.1 in Sierra Leone, 2 women, 4% in Uganda, 11 women, 2.2 in Nigeria, 32 women, 3.1 in Ghana, 5 women, and 1% in Zambia, 2 women. As they are small in number, women on death row are a neglected and overlooked population, and little attention has been paid to the experience which led to their incarceration or the challenges they face whilst incarcerated. The African Union, that probably you know is the most important regional continental organization we have in Africa, is currently considering an additional protocol to the African Charter on Human and People Rights on the abolition of the death penalty. A draft protocol has been adopted in 2014, but at the moment, after 6 years, is still on hold. It hasn't become any convention yet. At the 37th Ordinary Session in 2005, the African Commission on Human and People Rights decided to appoint 2 commissioners to work with the Special Rapporteur on Prison and Condition of Detention in Africa to produce a concept paper on the question of the death penalty on the continent. But also this effort achieved not very important result, to be honest. The imposition of the death penalty in accordance with the law was believed to be sanctioned by Article 4, the right to life, of the African Convention on Human and People Rights, although the African Commission has repeatedly called for its suspension. What is important also, it was another document that was produced by the African Commission on Human and People Rights, is a general comment number 3 that was issued in 2015 on the right to life. What paragraph 26 was saying? I'm quoting, where the death penalty has not yet been abolished, it shall be, in Africa of course, it shall be used in a completely transparent manner, with states giving reasonable advance notice of the timing, manner, and number of execution to those involved, including those under sentence of death, their families and lawyers, and to the public at large. States shall not conduct execution in public, nor use methods that cause unnecessary physical or mental suffering. After an execution, the body should be treated with respect, and where requested, be returned to the family for burial or other funeral rites, or information about the burial or cremation should be provided. Unfortunately, maybe you were expecting the abolition of death penalty in Africa, but in this comment, the African Commission just tried to make more human, let's say so, the death penalty. In effect, the African Charter of Human and People Rights does not include any provision recognizing the death penalty, even in limited circumstances. But the vast majority of African states have now abolished the death penalty in law or in practice. International law requires those states that have not yet abolished the death penalty to take steps towards its abolition in order to secure the rights to life and to dignity, in addition to other rights such as the right to be free from torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. In effect, also the African Union, also in this framework, also promoted missions in different African countries to verify the condition of prison and detention of both of men and women. The problem is that these mission reports are always very old, because many African countries still do not allow the rapporteur of the African Commission to visit their prison. So we have this report, but I mean, there are, I don't know, from 1996 in the case of Zimbabwe, in 1997, until the most recent one, they are from 2004, Ethiopia and South Africa. So it means in the last 16 years, there is no a report, a complete report made by the African Union on the condition of prisoners in Africa, both men and women, of course. What is also interesting to note, in Africa, we also have what is called the Maputo Protocol on the rights of women. That, I mean, someone who is not really expert on that can think that at least the Maputo Protocol exclude that penalty. But in fact, that's not the case. In fact, in this protocol, to protect and promote the rights of women in Africa, this protocol does not exclude that penalty per se. In fact, Article 4 to J only prescribe that, I'm quoting, states party shall take appropriate and effective measure to ensure that in those countries where the death penalty still exists, not to carry out death sentences on pregnant or nursing women. So only pregnant and nursing women, they are excluded by death penalty. Not by chance, this is sad to say, but one of the way in which several women have delayed the death penalty in Africa has been to remain pregnant. Sometimes also to the guard who were guarding them in prisons. But this at least allowed them to delay the execution. On this, we also have the second optional protocol to the ICCPR, that is the protocol, the UN protocol on civil and political rights, that is also applied to Africa. In fact, that's why I'm quoting it. That aim at the abolition of the death penalty. However, only to date, this protocol is a world protocol, dates of 1989. To date, 2020, only 15 countries in Africa have ratified the protocol. 15 out of 54, because in Africa there are 54 sovereign countries. So only 15 until now have ratified this world protocol to aiming at the abolition of the death penalty. However, there are new initiatives and trends that are appearing on Africa on this. For instance, since 2016, Congo and Guinea have also abolished capital punishment. Kenya has commuted more than 2,050 death sentences, including about 100 women, has commuted in life imprisonment. Benin also has commuted, the country last 14 death row prisoners in life imprisonment, in fact. While Burkina Faso has launched a process to formalize abolition of death penalty in the constitution, Gambia and Zimbabwe have announced that they would like to abolish the death penalty, and they have officially decreed a moratorium on execution, since that is still lasts until now, in fact. And to this moratorium, also other countries like Malawi, Namibia, and Eswatini have adopted a moratorium on death penalty in their country. On this, actually, we have this very recent resolution on the abolition of death penalty in Africa that has been adopted by the African Commission of Human and People Rights a bit more than 1 year ago, on the May 14, 2019. Once again, the African Commission urged states party to fully implement the right to life and the right to human dignity. Doing that, of course, abolishing death penalty. And also, urged states party that still retain the death penalty to observe a moratorium, the same one that was adopted, as we have seen in several countries like Malawi, Zimbabwe, Eswatini already. In this resolution, the African Commission recalled 2 precedent resolutions, but I don't want to mention them too much in detail because I see that the time is running by. What again, specifically the situation of women, most women have been sentenced in Africa to death for murder, often in relation to the killing of family members in a context of a gender-based violence. Cases of women in Uganda, Malawi, Nigeria, Ghana, and Sierra Leone being sentenced to death for killing their abusers received limited media attention. In many death penalty jurisdictions, gender-based violence is not considered at sentencing. Few lawyers present such evidence, and even where they do, the courts often discount it. In countries where the death penalty is a mandatory sentence for murder, such in Ghana and Sierra Leone, a woman's prior history as a survivor of physical or sexual abuse is still considered simply irrelevant, since the death penalty is automatically imposed for death-eligible offenses, without consideration of the woman's background or the circumstances of the crime. Most women in prison in Africa have a history of abuse, mental health problem, or have experienced socioeconomic deprivation. The majority of women on death row are from poor or marginalized communities and are illiterate, meaning they have limited knowledge about their legal rights. And they cannot read legal documents and are not fully engaged in their own defense. Further, they have limited resources to secure adequate legal representation. Moreover, prison conditions are very challenging in Africa for most women, and little attention has been paid to their gender-specific needs, while in detention in the prison system that was created by and for men. Women on death row in Africa can face further challenges. Many suffer mental trauma exacerbated by being on the death row. Some face stigma from other prisoners. In a few countries, women on the death row are shackled. Probably you remember the case of Maryam Ibrahim, that was sentenced to death row in Sudan for apostasy in 2014 and was shackled to heavy chains in prison while 8 months pregnant and caring for a young child. However, in this framework that on paper can seem positive, but on the field cannot seem so positive, while progress is being made, more needs to be done to focus on this neglected population, women on death row, and the impact of intersecting form of discrimination that is often ignored in the courtroom. A key step is to ensure that legal representation is provided so that women who are on the death row can appeal, in line with international fair trial obligation, of course. Further, more training and reform is needed to support gender-sensitive application of criminal laws, policies, and procedures. For instance, Malawi is a good example of how lawyers can play a vital role in highlighting the gender experience of women facing the death sentence. In May 2007, and I'm almost done, the High Court of Malawi found the mandatory death penalty unconstitutional, granting judges the discretion to apply the death penalty in the case of murder only after consideration, I'm quoting, of the manner in which the murder was committed, the means used to commit the offense, the personal circumstance of the victim, the personal circumstances of the accused, and what might have motivated the commission of the crime. All four women who had been sentenced to death at that time received individualized sentencing hearings, in which, for the first time in Africa, lawyers presented to first time in Africa, so in 2007, don't forget that date, lawyers presented to the court evidence to their indigence, history of abuse, mental illness, rehabilitation, and other mitigating factors. None of the women were resentenced to death or to life prison. That it was quite a novelty for the African panorama. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Cristiano, for presenting this really interesting paper. We are now moving to another presentation. This time is not on death penalty. We will have Luca. Let me just remove Cristiano. We will have Luca Sterkel. How do you pronounce it?
Sterkele.
Sterkele.
Yeah.
On this woman is completely unreasonable. Prison cultures and governmentality in a psychiatric prison ward.
Okay, just give me a sec. I'm
Sure.
trying to share the screen, but okay.
Do you need assistance?
Yeah, I think I need to give permission again to Google Chrome to do this, but could be complicated. Well, I can go without the slides. It was just about like 3 things. So
okay.
It was mainly for because I have quite a lot of ethnographic notes. So, but I'm gonna read it. So
All right.
it should be fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Luca Sterkere. I'm a research fellow at the Department of Sociology at the University of Padova in Italy. And today I'm going to reflect on some findings about the research I conducted for my PhD in the last 3 years. Like very in short, I conducted an ethnographic research in 3 prisons in the northeast of Italy, which was not specifically focused on women imprisonment. It was about the connections, let's say, between so-called prison cultures with the narratives and the everyday practices of prisons healthcare personnel in what are mainly male prisons, but in each one of the 3 there were some small sections which were dedicated to women imprisonment, and so I had the opportunity to find some early findings that then inspired the research I'm now trying to conduct. So today I'm going to concentrate my presentation on a specific case I had the opportunity to witness in one of those prisons, which was, as I said, predominantly a male one, but which contained 2 wards which were dedicated to women and a small area for the detention of female prisoners who were classified as psychiatric. So it was exactly in this ward that I met the women whose story inspired a little bit the reflection I'm trying to do today, which again, as I said, inspired a new research project on female imprisonment and mental health, to which I'm currently working, or at least trying to work, because the COVID outbreak stopped all the proceeding of the research. And so maybe I'm going to introduce it a little bit at the end of the presentation, but there are no findings yet about that research. So first of all, I'll give you some very brief details about women imprisonment in Italy, which I think could be useful to as a general frame for what I will say more in detail later. So in Italy, there are only 5 prisons which are exclusively dedicated to the imprisonment of women. In fact, only the 25% of detained women are locked up in an exclusively female institution, while the remaining 75% is located in sections created within male prisons, of which they reproduce spaces, organizational methods, and so on. And that's why some scholars argue that the configuration of female imprisonment is calibrated on a male model. So this makes us think a little bit about the multiple levels of marginalization existing within the prison system. There is a general prison population, which is per se already marginalized within a system which is marked by structural lack of resources, structural lack of personnel. Then there is the female population, which in being a so-called prison minority, is doubly exposed to those criticalities, because when there is availability of resources or activities and so on, those are usually directed toward the majority of the prison population, so that more people can enjoy those possibilities, but this reproduce a mechanism of isolation, frustration, and so on. And finally, within the same female population, there are some additional divisions which are based on formal or informal classifications of the prisoners, with a subsequent difference in the prison regimes to which they are subjected. And of particular significance, let's say, in this sense, are the formal and informal circuits that segment prison spaces. So prisoners categorized as high security, drug addicted, psychiatric, are often assigned to a specific prison space designed for their management and taken in charge. And those circuits are often designed in order to offer some sort of protection to those prisoners considered as, I don't know, particularly vulnerable or exposed to hurt and violence. But at the same time, they maximize isolation. They exacerbate the lack of resources, of which I was talking about, showing the profound ambivalence of, any instance of protection which is adopted in the prison place. And this was exactly the case of the psychiatric prison ward for imprisoned women, in which I conducted part of my ethnographic research. As I said, this was located in a quite big penitentiary in the northeast of Italy. It was like about 850 detainees, 75 of which were women. And this ward hosted, at the moment of my research, only 2 women. One was a Latin American woman with a pretty long prison experience, which was described by the psychiatrist as very deteriorated in her physical condition, unrecognizable for when she entered the prison and afraid of every stimulus and so on. I'm using the psychiatrist word, I want to point out. So and the other one, whose story is the one on which I'm going to concentrate the most in this presentation, was a Nigerian woman in her late 30s, which was transferred to the psychiatric ward from another small penitentiary in central Italy because, as the psychiatrist told me, she was making troubles in there. So since the first day in which I've been in the psychiatric ward, I quickly understood that this woman was considered to be very troubling, both for the prison staff and for the healthcare staff. In an ethnographic note, in fact, I wrote that the prison officer reported to the psychiatrist some information about this Nigerian woman who seemed to be quite agitated. And he said, "I don't know if you ever heard her scream. Today, every time I passed through the corridor, she would scream. She's completely unreasonable." So given the behavior of the women, who was actually perceived by the prison staff as very problematic, both like from the like healthcare point of view and from the prison from the like security point of view, let's say, they evaluated some strategies in order to control her, to treat her. And I think the reflection they made like in prison equips to which I assisted, and in some other occasions, are pretty interesting for a sociological understanding of the mechanisms of govern of female inmates, which are deployed in the prison context, at least from a quite explorative point of view. So at first, it was possible to see how the informal mechanism of, I don't know if the word really exists, but premiality, it is what in England and Wales is formalized as the incentives and earn privilege scheme. And this mechanism was particularly pregnant in the governmental strategies of the prison as a whole, but also in this little psychiatric world, because this is a well-known thing for sure, but in this case it was particularly interesting, both because of its informality and for the fact that its articulation was made in a mix of prison management strategies and psychiatric knowledge. In an ethnographic note I wrote, like, the woman has been locked up in her cell, which was going to remain completely closed door for some time. This happened because she made troubles in the last few days. And the psychiatrist seemed to agree to this solution, because he said keeping her closed up is worse, as it aggravates her symptoms and clinical condition. But it is also wrong to give her the message, you can do anything you want. Containment makes sense. After all, he says, you have to conquer things. If you earn them, well. If not, So it is clear from the words of prison workers and healthcare personnel that she's behaving that way to protest against a prison regime that she perceived as very unfair. However, both the reasons of her protest and the concrete modalities she took to protest were directly pathologized by the psychiatric staff, because they said she's someone with no future because she has a delirium of reuniting with her daughter, but there's no way out of this situation. Any obstacle that stands on the way of reuniting her with her daughter only feeds her condition. So the only solution they were like evaluating, they were thinking about, was to treat her condition while finding a proper way of governing her, like what they saw as her hostility. So as the option of keeping her closed up in her cell was not clearly feasible in the long run, other strategies were proposed. One pretty neat was pharmacologization, so increasing the amount of benzodiazepines or drugs prescribed for her. But that one was soon discarded from the psychiatrist, of course, because he said, that way we're not going to take her out of our feet anymore. We're going to always have to stand by her and whatever. And they clearly didn't want to do this. So consequently, only two solutions were pondered by the psychiatrist. And both are pretty interesting enough, were strongly connected with a prison habitus and a penitentiary mode, of informal governmentality. The first one was prison transfer, completely regardless of her clinical conditions. I have a piece of interview with a psychiatrist in which he said, the only solution is to make her turn, as you do with every other problematic prisoner, because at least in every place she goes, she gets the idea of getting always a little closer to the exit. And he said, it's a suicidal game, but it's the only solution. And when he said that, the prison officer who was in the section was pretty doubtful about this proposal, because he said, we have to find another prison in which they take prisoners with the psychiatric classification, because it's a juridical thing. And the psychiatrist replied, no, well, that's exactly why we have to remove the psychiatric code. You know, we have to remove the psychiatric frame that we applied to her so that we can move her somewhere else. The second possibility, that is one I found pretty interesting in a certain sense, it is one which make leverage on like informal prison cultures, because the also this time it was the psychiatrist who said she can stay upstairs, in which there were like the common women detained, like not those with a psychiatric code, let's say. So he said she can stay upstairs. So at least if she mess up, if she make troubles in there, the others will take care of regulating the situation. It is a dynamic that can be bad, but you know, it's typical of prison regulation. And this reliance on prison cultures in order to keep the place as it should be on the, like from the prison staff point of view, was also expressed like with basing on some gendered stereotypes, gendered mechanism, because he then said, you know, yeah, it's true that it's not like in men's prison, but women, on the other hand, tend to implement more subtle, less direct mechanism, but which I'm sure they work just as fine. That said by the psychiatrist. So the regulatory and pedagogical intervention of the other inmates is seen in this case as necessary for the management of this women. She's described as totally unreasonable and therefore unable to adapt to the formal and informal mechanisms that regulate prison life. The fact is that she's not able of doing time, so the others have to teach her how it is appropriate to behave in that place. And that being said by an healthcare worker is quite interesting, because it shows exactly how the mechanisms of prisonizations that were mentioned before, how the moral and symbolic horizon of the penitentiary is strongly interiorized by everyone who's working also the daily in prison's daily life. So to all those things, during the keep meetings, other relevant themes have emerged, like narratives about the model of the good mother versus the bad mother, about the docility of women prisoners who do not engage in violent behavior because of some sort of femininity or so on, emerged. And all those things led to like the new research project I was talking about before, which should have started, as I said, some months ago, but it's now like blocked. Hopefully in the next few weeks something will be done. Okay, thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Luca, so much. I am now going to stop for a little debate. So I'm going to pull the first three presenters up to the screen. So Diana, Luca, and Cristiano. And we can have some time to talk a little bit about your presentations. We have comments here from our audience. So I will just pop up the first one. The first comment, actually question, is for Diana. Let's see if it appears on the screen. Perfect. So Carolina Ugarte asked Diana, given the persisting concerns, what was the prevalence of self-harm, suicide, or suicide among the women you interviewed, if any? Diana, do you want to say some words on this?
Okay. Actually, like only a few women shared that they felt suicidal when they were about to be transferred from their jails of origin to the main women's prison where they were incarcerated. So one woman, I rushed to the presentation, but anyway, in the quote that I showed, she actually thought of taking the gun of one of the jail guards and shooting herself with it. But other than this particular informant, I think only 2 other women considered like harming themselves, like by banging their heads on the wall, or one another woman I interviewed. There's one time she was really upset because her daughter did push with her visit. So one afternoon she thought of drinking like bleach, but like they were actually the minority for the women I interviewed. Like the women, not too many women disclosed stories of wanting to harm themselves or take their own lives. Thank you for the question.
Fantastic. We have another question, and I believe this one would be for Cristiano. So Vanessa
Yes.
Cavalcanti asks, extreme cases like the death penalty could be in the past, but they still follow some countries. Does this relate to the dictatorial regimes of the states in which it is practiced?
Well, it's an interesting question, but I wouldn't say so, in the sense that, of course, democracy is intended in Europe. In Africa, arrived a bit later, but still there are so-called democracies in Africa where death penalty is still in place formally. So it's the question is that if we can maybe if you want to link dictatorial regime with that penalty per se, maybe you can find a link in the past. But if you just want to speak about the situation of women, there is not really any kind of link between dictatorial regime and an harsh, of course, policy on women. Of course, what it can be so in the African experience is that many of the countries where still today death penalty is in place also for women are countries where the right of women are still very neglected, and many of them, they are countries, they're fully, they are Muslim countries. In fact, they are the same countries in which, for instance, they accept traditional practices like what we call female genital mutilations. So there are always, many situations in which, in fact, what it can be seen elsewhere as a crime in many African contexts is still seen as a tradition. So it's a bit of a cultural thing, of course, but it's not exactly related to the lack of democracy. It's more related to cultural issues, I would say. The fact that women can be persecuted and prosecuted and condemned to the death row. So it's I would more see culture instead of lack of democracy, because they can be, for instance, I have in mind, for instance, Libya was during Gaddafi regime was not really considered a democracy, but women who were sentenced to death row, there were very few, for instance. So yeah, so I wouldn't link the two things, but I would just say that I would just reflect on the cultural legacy that still is very strong in many African contexts.
Thank you, Cristiano. Do you want to add something on this, Diana?
Something that I have to say is like the death penalty and how it's implemented here in the Philippines. It's been so inconsistent. It changes depending on who happens to be the president. Like the president right now has been so intent on reviving the death penalty. And the president then, when the death penalty was suspended, she herself actually flip-flopped on the issue of the death penalty. First, she said she was against capital punishment because she's really religious. But then later on, she said she wouldn't stand in the way of executions. And then around the time she was being investigated for electoral fraud, all of a sudden she pressured Congress to fast track a bill to suspend capital punishment. So, yeah, like I think this is definitely related to the kind of political climate, and a lot of times sentences are politicized. So when the government's really authoritarian or under a lot of pressure, then people will tend towards they tend to favor more punitive approaches. But when officials are all of a sudden being investigated for various anomalies, they use prison reforms as a way of putting a check mark next to their name. So, I mean, it's a very volatile situation, even as we speak. Even with the pandemic now, the president wants to bring back the death penalty.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your answer. We have another comment question for Luca. So, in regards to knowledge of psychiatric disorders, how to support, how much training do corrections officers or guards in Italy have? Is this related only to psych professionals? Thank you. This question is from Carolina Ugarte.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I will say it depends from the prison, from the specific prison. There was one in which I did the research in which there was training for prison officers, but this was because that prison used to be sort of criminal asylum or something like that. So it was really focused on at least the aim of the institution should have been that of treatment, and they had quite a lot to do with psychiatric disorders of various types. So the officers get a training, and when the criminal asylum closed and became a prison, the same prison officers remained. So they had like this sort of training in like de-escalation of conflict and whatsoever. In another one, this was mainly done by the psychiatrist. Like it was exactly in this case I told before, in which he said one time he said when you deal with the psychiatrist told to the prison officers that when he deal with the prisoners he shouldn't scream or do whatever, because he said in psychiatry we don't have bars, so if you scream you get punched in the face most of the time. So you don't have to be rude as you do with other prisoners maybe. But those were the only examples I had. All the healthcare staff was complaining about the lack of training for prison officers, and also prison officers actually were complaining about not being really able to deal with some sort of situations.
Thank you, Luca. I have a question actually for you before we move into the following presentation. Since you have experience with observing both male and female prisoners, did you find any gender differences in terms of the prisonization process, or you still don't have enough?
Yeah, that was exactly the research question for the new research I was supposed to do. Because I found it pretty interesting with like the small occasions I had the opportunity to witness, and also in some interviews I did with like former women in prison that were completely like deconstructing the stereotype of another prison culture, which was not which have nothing to do with violence, for example. While the stories I collected were quite permeated with violence, I'd say. Mm-hmm. So there was like this, like how the women prison culture is seen by prison staff and other prison workers, which was like depicted in a totally different way, and how it was narrated to me by the 2 or 3 women I had the opportunity to talk to, which was, different in some ways. I have to go deeper into it, but some similarities were like, I don't know, there was like some sort of stereotypical thinking about some sort of women prison culture by the staff. I mean.
Okay. Thanks, Luca. Thank you so much. So we will continue with this session. And right now we are going to listen to Riddhi. Okay, so Riddhi, you are going to talk about N3 writings, an anthropological inquiry into prison writings from India, right?
Yes.
Okay, good luck.
Thank you so much, Sílvia. I will just share my screen. Okay, is that visible? Okay, great. Yeah, cool. Right, thank you so much, Sílvia. And I want to thank SIGP for the opportunity to present my work here. So this presentation is based on my master's thesis, in which I ethnographically engage with the genre of prison writings from India. In a sense, this is a work in progress as I build on it further with my PhD project. I'm now a PhD student. I just started in September at the Graduate Institute in Geneva with the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. So I would really welcome and appreciate comments, criticisms, questions related to my presentation. If it's something long which cannot be said here, I've put up my email address, so please feel free to contact, and I would really, really appreciate that. I want to take a moment to clarify before we proceed what I mean by prison writings. So for my research, prison writings have been defined as writings which emerge from and about experiences of incarceration. So these include prison memoirs, prison diaries, letters, poetry, blog articles, other forms of write-ups that people do, and so on. So that is various forms of writings which are produced by prisoners or by former prisoners after they're released, which document their first-hand carceral experiences. So that's how I basically define prison writings. And as this panel specifically focuses on women in the prison system in today's presentation, I will try to draw more from the lives of women prison writers and their works, which I engage with. Though, just to sort of be honest and transparent, my thesis and my research was not women-centered, but I did engage with aspects of gender within my research, but it was not a purely women or a gender sort of a thematic in my research. Okay, so cool. So my motivation for reading prison writings comes from my interest in understanding the everyday experiences of incarceration. Most of the research on prisons, and particularly in the context of Indian prisons, addresses the dehumanized conditions of prisons and pays attention to human rights issues of the prisoners. So while all of this research is commendable and is very, very important in itself, it falls short of theorizing narratives from prison life and the everyday experiences of incarceration. So I'm particularly talking about research in India, which is a lot of it actually has been done by activists and scholars who are also activists and are sort of working towards improving the life of prisoners. So most of the research then sort of becomes focused on the conditions inside, on the sort of food that is available, the healthcare that's available, the overcrowding in prisons, the rights, the violations of rights, torture. So those are the themes. And so in that, while it is very important, something sort of gets left out, and that is something that I'm trying to sort of look for in prison writings. To that end, by looking at prison writings as my object of study, I ask, in what ways can prison writings contribute towards the knowledge on prison systems and the experiences of incarceration, which have more often been studied institutionally and documented only from above? Further, how can prison writings become objects of analyses and tools for understanding prison institutions and carceral experiences from below, from the point of view of the prisoners? Okay, so methodologically, I follow a two-pronged approach. The first of these involves a close interpretive reading of the text. The second and equally important approach involves interviews with prison writers, but also with a couple family members and a few publishers who were sort of involved in this whole process of writing and publishing prison writing. So by pointing out to this, I sort of want to bring the links of how, even though prison writings, books, memoirs that we see might appear sort of an individual endeavor of the prisoner, they actually sort of produced more socially. So there are elements that are brought forward by family members, by publishers, and they are part of the whole process, which we must acknowledge. Here, I must also admit that all my prison writers and interlocutors were men. Unfortunately, I had very little time to do fieldwork. However, in my reading, I considerably engaged with writings that were available from and by women prison writers. Unfortunately, I'm yet to come across prison writings from the LGBTQI community and the prisoners who identify with that identity in India. But my pursuit continues, and I hope to sort of get more narratives from women and from the LGBTQI community as I proceed with my research. I chose to focus on contemporary published writings, published or sort of translated, and which came into circulation recently within the last 2 decades, to sort of be in the moment in that sense, as my main material for analysis. And this decision was partly a choice and also partly a compulsion due to the absence of availability of any curated, unpublished prison writings. But also, I must highlight the sensitive nature of incarceration and the writing practices connected with it. And hence, working with published material was an ethical choice as well, which ensured that I was reading only those writings which had been consciously published by their authors for all to read. I mean, we know writings through prisons are often sort of smuggled out, smuggled in, writing instruments and paper and a lot of stuff associated with writing practices sort of moves in and out, often illegitimately. So then it sort of becomes important that we handle whatever material we get more sensitively. And so published writings is a sort of a safe choice. In the remaining part of my presentation, due to the limited time that we have today, I will briefly speak about my own experience of reading some women prison writers and highlight one striking way in the writings as they sort of come to be different from that of their male counterparts. And then finally, I will elaborate on just one important theme from several more that sort of emerged from my reading and analysis of the prison writings. So I will basically be talking about the bodily inscription of incarceration, which is a theme which sort of repeatedly emerges in prison writings from India and prison writings elsewhere as well. But because, you know, I'm working with Indian prison writing, so it certainly emerges there. And just to give a quick glimpse of what the other two thematics are, which I was initially thinking of talking about, but I'll just skip. For now, we're connected with the experience of time. So that's another theme, the experience of time, how different prisoners make sense of time, the waiting, the longing. That aspect is another aspect which very prominently emerges in prison writings. And the other thing that sort of is interesting is the movement of objects and the movement of writings and their circulation within the prison boundaries and inside and outside the prison boundaries. That's another theme which sort of emerges repeatedly in prison writings. Okay, so in the case of Indian prisons, women's carceral spaces resemble men's carceral spaces in more ways than one can imagine. The issues of inhumane living conditions, unpalatable and nutritionless food, infringements of prisoners' rights, and the general corruption and harassment by prison staff is a common theme and is common among both men's and women's carceral facilities. So are the stories of shared pain, mutual comforting, and camaraderie between male and female prisoners. Moreover, India's prison system largely overlooks the identities of LGBTQI prisoners and their first-hand prison experiences and stories of incarceration. These are as missing in the prison writings, as is any information about them in any official reports or statistics. So unfortunately, while the state and while the institutions have sort of ignored this whole community, in a similar way, they're also sort of missing in this whole space of prison writing, in this whole universe of prison writings. However, one striking difference, or one sort of striking finding that I had when I was sort of looking at all of these prison writings, and in a way which sort of can highlight and sort of is a point of difference basically between men's prison writings and women's prison writings, is the presence of children and is the narratives about children in the prison writings. Physically in women's wards, but also in the writings. So Joya Mitra's Killing Days, though a little bit dated as a book, elegantly captures the anomalous presence of children who also lead incarcerated lives alongside their mothers in women's prison wards. As she writes, on some days, children, while at play, offer delightful moments to the incarcerated women amidst the glum prison environment. And on other days, seeing their suffering can also be deeply heartbreaking as their mothers are physically punished and humiliated right in front of their eyes. So in women's prison writings, the aspect of motherhood the sort of stands out precisely because there are children who are present in the wards living with mothers, young children up to the age of 6, sometimes even more. But also there are these relationships around mothering which sort of emerge in the prison, and their kinship ties sort of forged between prisons. So that is something which is very more prominent in women's prison writings, the few that I sort of got my hands on and I could read when I sort of compare them with men's prison writings. Okay, and now finally, I sort of want to speak about this one important theme of bodily inscriptions of incarceration, which kept reappearing and which keeps reappearing in my reading of these writings. By bodily inscriptions of incarceration, I refer to the etching and the inscription of imprisonment in the bodies of the prisoners. Through these effects, which persistently remain in the minds and bodies of the prisoners, I also want to invoke the longevity of incarceration beyond the actual imprisonment. So several prison writers write about this aspect of incarceration, which is even more significant for those prisoners whose imprisonment periods have been extended. These bodily inscriptions of incarceration can manifest in the form of gain or loss of weight and body strength, or permanent damages to organs and limbs, due to torture or due to neglect of health issues by prison authorities, due to poor nutrition, and due to the hazardous living conditions inside Indian prisons. But they also manifest in form of habits which get inscribed in the body. So basically here I'm arguing that because of the conditions in which sort of incarceration takes place and the toll that it takes on people's minds and bodies, it sort of in some ways elongates and prolongs the period of incarceration, because even after these prisoners are released from the prisons, their trauma doesn't end, their incarceration doesn't end because of these permanent damages that have been caused to their bodies and their minds. So here I want to bring in a woman prison writer, Anjum Zamrud Habib, and her book, Prisoner Number 100, which left a very strong mark on me when I read it, and I would actually encourage people who are interested in sort of this genre to read it. Written in Urdu and translated into English by woman activist and researcher Sahaba Hussain, the book narrates Habib's story in her own words of surviving the adversity of incarceration as a Kashmiri Muslim woman wrongly condemned on terrorism charges. Habib is a political activist from Kashmir who was branded as a terrorist and incarcerated for 5 years in the Tihar jail in Delhi. She was released at the end of 2007, and this book was produced in the following months on the suggestion and encouragement of her friend Hussain, who then later translated the work into English. The book is also a rare and valuable account of Kashmir's political situation and from the perspective of a Kashmiri woman activist. However, I limit my engagement for the purpose of this thesis to Habib's incarceration-related memories and musings. Towards the end of her memoir, as Habib describes her release, she wrote, "When I took and I quote, she wrote, "When I took my first step outside the gate, my legs gave way and I could not walk. I had lost the habit of walking without my hand being held." End quote. As a high-risk prisoner, a tag imposed upon her due to the alleged terrorism charges, Habib was always physically restrained by a female officer. Every time in the 5 years of incarceration, whenever she had to step out of the prison, which was mostly for court hearings, she was always restrained by a physical presence, by a woman officer. In the translator's note to Habib's book, her friend Hussein shared that after Habib returned home from her release, for days she could not sleep on a mattress, but instead chose to sleep on the bare floor. She also found it difficult to bathe and change into a fresh set of clothes, and preferred not to sit under the open sky, but to stay inside the room. Several prison writers, both men and women, have actually written about such experiences and have sort of spoken about this long remaining effect of incarceration on their bodies. And hence we can see that through and in these bodily inscriptions of incarceration, prison terms always exceed the time for which they are awarded. And sometimes they never completely fade away. So to conclude, through my research, I argue for greater engagement with prison writings by academics, researchers, and government authorities and organizations who are trying to work with prisoners, who are trying to work on prisoners' rights, who are trying to work on the conditions of prisons. By doing this, I'm trying to privilege the voice of the prisoners by hearing their narratives and experiences in their writing and in their voice, and to some extent on their terms. We can expand our understanding of prison institutions and widen the scope of issues that we engage with in relation to incarceration. By doing this, the issues which will emerge will be more sensitive to the needs of the prisoners. So I'm sort of making a methodological argument about how prison writings, beyond being a literary genre, can actually sort of feed into our research and feed into our interventions towards improving prison conditions. The overarching thematic of this conference for this year asks the question, is prison a democratic space? And so when I reflect on prison writings as an object, as a genre, and as a practice, I see the potential for giving a unique voice to the prisoners, which perhaps several other forms of research and interventions may not. Practices of prison writing, the right to write under incarceration, the right itself to sort of practice writing when imprisoned, and active reading and engagement with these writings, which get produced against all odds, can perhaps take us a little closer to imagining the presence of certain democratic ethos in carceral institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riddhi, for your presentation. We will now listen to Daniela. Daniela Ronco.
Okay.
Here you are, Daniela. And Daniela will talk with us about health protection in prison between equivalence of care and less eligibility.
Oh.
Eligibility, yes.
Eligibility. That's okay. Thank you. I just tried to share my my screen.
Let me know if you need assistance.
Oh, I don't know.
You just click on share screen.
Yes.
And then select the presentation.
Can you see the presentation? No.
Not yet.
Oh, I try again. Oh, okay. I try again, but I think you have the same problem as Luca, but no problem. I think I can read just some interviews which I wanted to show, so that's not a problem.
All right.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Sílvia. I am Daniela Ronco by the University of Torino in Italy, and I'm going to talk to you about health protection in prison between equivalence on care and less eligibility. Just a few words for contextualization of the topic. On 2008, in Italy, we had the prison healthcare reform, which transferred the prison health responsibility from the Ministry of Justice to the Ministry of Health, as prescribed by European prison rules and policies. And the main goal of the reform was the equivalence of care principle. The main question in my research is if this goal, or to what extent this goal is achievable. So just a quick overview of the methodology. I refer to three big national studies to which I participate since 2010. And this was quantitative and qualitative studies using both methodologies, so questionnaires, interviews, and focus groups to prisoners, prison doctors, and prison staff. The complex results of these researches could be summarized in 2 points, in 2 big issues. The first one is the structural violence of prison. We observed a strong impact of the prison structure on the protection of health. We refer to ambient and power in particular. And we could say, in the sense that every aspect in the daily life of in prison is linked to health care. And so the normative tools alone, in this case the prison health reform, can't impact on structural conditions of prisons. As Ivan Hillik in his classical text Medical Nemesis referred to ambient and power as the main determinants of health conditions, we can observe that this is particularly true inside prisons, where factors like food, water, air, and the level of socio-political equality are determinants and very important in the life, the daily life in prison. This seems particularly true inside prisons, where we observe as typical detention conditions some factors like the insufficiency of food quantity and variety. Cell and common spaces are considered a risk factor for health, both for prisoners and prison staff. The absence of privacy, the continuous noise, no regular exercise and movement of the open air, no access to treatment activities outside cells, and above all, the psychological impact of the prison. So, in the words of a prison doctor, prison condition that we interviewed, the prison conditions pose a major risk to contract infectious disease, like he referred, for example, to hepatitis B, to tuberculosis, etc., due to the overcrowding and the structural conditions, lack of hygiene, etc., inside prison. And we can understand how all these reflections are extremely actual and alarming in the if we consider the ongoing pandemic. Then the psychological impact of imprisonment in the prison, in the word of a prisoner. He said, being in jail without the love of my family, I got sick of anxiety and panic, and I take pills to sleep. I think to my son and my wife outside, but here is like a slave mate. Everything is suspended, and if you don't work or have any other safety valve, you fall sick, as it happened to me, of anxiety and panic. So the second big issue is the professional culture. In particular, the ambivalence between the code of medical ethics and the prison culture. A dual loyalty to which the prison doctor is subject. And this is, we observed it in many examples, like the professional autonomy, which is reduced in prison. For example, in determining, in choosing when to prescribe an external visit, for example. And here we come to, we can observe the institutionalization of prison doctors, which is more or less evident, but which exists. In the words of a prison doctor, I think that health in prison can't ignore security, because the prison doctor is halfway between a doctor and a policeman. Training a prison doctor is not easy, because he must be trained on the field, but he also needs particular talent. There are people who are not fit to work here. And that was an example of what I was explaining. And a particular feature of the institutionalization process is what I call the obsession of simulation. All prison doctors refer to being manipulated by prisoners. They say, for example, that the prisoners, the most of them, want to get out, and to this end, they are able to do everything, to simulate everything. So, the prison context is typically characterized by a radical and structural exercise of control due to intersection between care and security requests. And so the question is the equivalence of care. One of the main results is that the principle of care is strongly compromised by the less eligibility principle, governing many aspects of life in prison, according to which the prison condition must always be a step under the normal worst prison condition outside prison. And so the equivalence of care principle is strongly compromised by less eligibility governing prison. And at the end of the research, we came to take up a new interpretation of this principle, the equivalence of care, moving from the equivalence of standards to the equivalence of objectives. In prison, we know there is an over-representation of mental and physical problems. So prisoners are entitled to healthcare standards which are higher than those outside prisons. So national policies should be brave in this sense, and should pay greater attention to the outcomes than to the process of healthcare provision, do not hesitating also to invest more resources in that field. We are too many is are some words that use a prisoner and at the end of an interview, and this is this phrase, "we are too many," is the sad conclusion of those interview, which precisely I think summarize the structural and cultural issues in prisons. Because the big question is, does the prison healthcare reform is reformable without a structural reform of the prison system as a whole? And here, obviously, we come to the classical debate between abolitionism and reformism. So, to what extent prison is reformable just by norms? And to conclude, the research in this field so legitimate as to assert that the prison healthcare can't be improved and the equivalence of care principle can't be achieved without a structural reform of the prison system as a whole. And health safeguard in prison, in this sense, is closely linked to decriminalization policies, to decarceration policies, and to the use of prison as extrema ratio. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Daniela. You are right on time. I didn't need to appear on the
slide.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for your presentation. Since we don't have a lot of comments and questions so far, I would suggest we can just continue with the presentations and we have a debate in the end. So I would ask Bianca to present next. Bianca, are you there? Bianca is not there. So I'll present and then Bianca will be the last one to present. So I will be the one presenting now. So let's see if I can control myself in terms of time too. All right, so my own banner. Sorry, I'm putting my own banner here. All right, and I'll share my screen with you all. Okay. Oh, it must be opened. Sorry, now I know what happened with you all. But I think I can do this now. Share screen, application window, here it is. Okay. All right. Sorry. I'm trying to. I cannot open it. You are actually seeing my own notes because I'm not being able to. There it is. Okay. All right, now we're ready. So today I'll be presenting on a qualitative and longitudinal approach to female prisoners' reentry process in Portugal. And this is this presentation in particular. So this is a part of a qualitative and longitudinal study I'm currently developing. And that is focused on reentry recidivism and criminal resistance. But the presentation today will only focus on female prisoners' reentry process, okay? So I just want to clarify that. So on the literature, there is an abundance of studies on prison and prisoner reentry, recidivism, and resistance. However, criminological research on reentry has been inattentive to the experiences of women, focusing mainly on men. Successful reentry after release. Those re-entering the community recidivate at high rates, and this has social, political, and economic consequences for individuals, families, and entire communities. Taking a look into reentry studies and gender, reentry experiences of women remain largely understudied, with a few exceptions, and a couple of studies consider the gender differences between men and women's reentry experiences. We know that drug dependence, lower educational levels, or a long criminal record make women recidivate at a higher level. Employment, housing, and treatment affects the recidivism rates the same way for both males and females. Urban residence, childhood and recent abuses, living with a criminal partner, selling drugs, stress, depression, fearfulness, and suicidal thoughts are positive predictors of recidivism for women more than for men. We know the study follows, so the study that I'm currently developing follows the 3 reentry phases, being the first stage inside prison, the second one on the transition to the outside, and the third one 3 years after prisoners' release. For under life trajectories and ex-prisoners. So the main objective of this study is to understand recidivism and resistance are defined by analyzing both the criminal system and trajectories of prisoners and ex-prisoners, considering the intersection of their ethnicity and age on study. I already developed the first and the second stage of this research. And here I'll try to cover mostly the second stage, so on the transition to the side. For understanding the trajectories of prisoners and ex-prisoners, it is the perspective of life course, having in mind some of its key concepts, such as territories, life events, transitions, turning points, linked lives, and social timing. I consider this perspective as to be complementary and analytical approaches that shape the criminal behavior and help understand the reentry process, namely the theories of structured mainly concept, which will not develop a lot on this, but you want me to discuss a little bit more, I can do that in the end. Age, ethnicity, class. Exploring in-depth in the reentry process through a qualitative research instead of focusing in a more quantitative research. Fieldwork was conducted in 3 male and 1 female. That was collected through the direct observation in conversation and documental and descriptive prisoners' files. In total, 93 interviews were conducted with professionals from various clinics, from the health services, psychological services, social range, so and so on and so forth. Prisoners, prison, and 78 interviews were conducted, and 28 female. During the second phase, ex-prisoners were interviewed on the first 6 months after release. Out of 78 individuals were interviewed. The decrease on the initial sample to individuals from further participating in the study after release. Loss of contact and being in prison, either because they are still serving time or because they were readmitted. This presentation will focus on the reentry process of 4 women before and immediately after release. A total of 8 interviews were analyzed, 8 from when they were serving time in prison and 4 from the first 6 months after release. Their narratives are analyzed with qualitative content analysis and focus on the role of the prison and social reintegration system, the challenges women face during the post-release period, and the strategies they use to cope with the reentry into their communities. So you have an idea on who these women are. Their age range from 27 years old to 48 years old. Most of them were in prison for drug trafficking. The age of the first offense vary from 19 years old to 42 years old, and they were in prison most of the time between 4 to 5 years. The prisoner that was longer in prison was because the type of crime that it was swindling. And when they were interviewed, all of them were in parole. So when we discuss the role of prison and the social reintegration systems, when they were interviewed in prison, they talk a lot about how they participated in programs and activities, both work and school, but mostly working activities. They had a strong belief in work and school as a way of improving their chances after release. Although they had some criticism about the school curriculum being basic, school as helping seeing, but also as school as helping seeing life in a different way, and promises that they will be working with the same companies after their release. So there were some testimonies of companies that were running inside of the prison that they would transfer their services to the outside when they were released. They also pointed out the excess of medication given to prisoners who are unoccupied. So whenever they didn't have any sort of programming inside prison, they exposed it, or they revealed that a lot of medication was accessible and were given to these women as a way of controlling them. They say that they look like zombies. But in the end, they all talk about prison as a life lesson because it changes them. So after release, after being on the outside, they present critiques to the social reintegration system. They have monthly visits where they talk about crime, and they understand these visits as controlling their lives. So instead of being there to help them and to assist them, they are there more to control them. So as, for example, Maria was saying, they want to know how things are at home, if I have a good relationship with my husband, but they do not ask if we have food to eat. If we did not find a job, they demand us to find one. They only demand, I wanted to have a job like that. Just writing and sitting at the desk. So they are pretty critique to how these professionals of the social reintegration system deal with them. And so they complain about the lack of help from the social integration system. In terms of challenges, before leaving prison, they perceived as being more challenging being again with their children, okay? Because they could see that some obstacles would be on the way. They were planning on working and reuniting with their children, and sometimes they had to find a job to be able to reunite with their children, especially if they were institutionalized or if they were handed to a family or someone else that was taking care of them while they were in prison. So they dreamed with being outside for long walks and enjoying. They also mentioned changing their addresses, so changing where they lived, new homes, everything new, and possible challenges that they were foreseeing would be finding a job because of the stigma and their age, especially for the ones that were getting older, and not being helped by the professionals of the social reintegration system. After release, some of these fears were kind of visible. So social reintegration system not helping and negatively interfering actually with their work. For example, they mentioned that because they have these meetings, sometimes with the social reintegration professional, sometimes these meetings are in the middle of their work hours, and so it affects negatively the relationship with their employers. Not being able to meet their expectations after prison, both work and children. So they expose, for example, being exploited in their job, or mentioning that finding a house is really difficult. In extreme cases, not food to eat, so they are in extreme places, like in poverty level. Another interesting finding is that they find challenging living a life of freedom, because they spend so much time in prison that they feel like prison now is in their lives. So they understand that prison changed them in a way that they continue to have the same way of living on the outside as they had on the inside. In a sense that even Patricia says, how did I lose 25 years of my life in 4 years? 4 years of prison was enough to steal my 25 years of freedom. So those 4 years changed completely the way she acts, the way that she just goes from home to work and from work to home, and she doesn't have a life, a proper life. Another challenging is facing depression, sadness, and frustration. And paradoxically, some women miss prison because of its bubble effect. So they feel like in prison they were protected, and now that they are on the outside, they are facing all the problems. So I thought it was hard to be in prison, but the moment I was released, it's not hard getting out of prison, it's hard living out of prison. In terms of strategies to cope with re-entry, most of them mention social network and family as means to access social capital resources. So 2 women found jobs immediately after release, and these jobs were provided by a friend or a family member. The only woman jobless at the time didn't have a social network capable of helping her, and the other woman found work inside her family relations, taking care of an uncle and living with him. Even being aware that they will not regain the time they have lost with their children from being in prison, they try to spend as much time as they can with their children. Other women talk about religion as being also a strategy to help them cope with re-entry. And other women talk about stop taking medicines, especially because of what I mentioned before, of being over-medicated when we're in prison, and they need to stop taking that medication to be able to cope. And finally, help with in NGOs. We find that there's a disconnect from prison memories and their criminal self. So a lot of women try to not think about prison at all, not engaging in or avoiding conversations with people about the time spent in prison. They change address in order to not face their neighborhoods, their old neighborhoods. And even they leave their prison objects behind. So this is a way of leaving prison behind and trying not to be associated with it. And just on the contrary side, we have an opposite type of strategy that is connected. So sometimes they feel like they need to go back to prison to feel peace and to feel protected, to be able to go to continue with the re-entry process, like Maria. So life is so, we put our heads under so much stress when we go out that we try to look for our corner, and then remember our corner when we want it to be quiet. In the corner of the ward, in the corner of the cell. They closed the door at 7 o'clock and it was quiet for me. For me, it was the best, being there in my corner. So sometimes the pressure outside and the problems outside and obstacles outside are so overwhelming that they feel prison and being on that quiet place they had before to go outside. So finally, what we see, what we can clearly perceive is barriers on the re-entry process as being identified through the lens of the ex-prisoners themselves. Some of these barriers are similar to the ones that we can identify on the literature. So they are traditional barriers we have out there. But what strikes me most is this continuous punishment that we see on their testimonies. So violence, incarceration, and other forms of punishment are recurring in their testimonies. And even the need to go back to prison or having a sort of life that is similar to what they had in prison shows us how much prison impacted their own lives. We can see the visible differences in their narratives between the moments before and after imprisonment, from hope to sadness and frustration. The prison life is lived on the outside. Parole time is an extension of being imprisoned, but with less, psychologically marked by prison experiences. This is preliminary results. I have more interviews that I still need to work a little bit more on them, so the size of the sample is really small. And here I'm only focusing on important markers like ethnicity, social class, age later. Thank you so much. I hope I was on time. I was running a little bit. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And let's see if Bianca now. Okay, Bianca, it's your time now.
Hi.
Okay. Hi, Bianca.
Okay. Hi.
It's the last.
I can't hear you. I'm not sure if it's my internet or yours.
Probably it was mine. Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Okay, so Bianca will share experiences of women who killed abusive partners in the system. Go, Bianca.
Okay. Hi. Can you see my screen, everybody? Because I'm not sure if it's already there.
No, it's not. So you have to have the presentation already opened.
Yeah, it's
And when
open,
you...
and to me, it shows that I am already sharing the screen. It's like
okay. It's completely black.
Oh, that's strange.
Now it's not. Now, oops, it was there. Can you go? Okay, there it is. Okay, good luck.
Okay, thank you. So I guess it's just the first slide that wasn't showing. Okay. I'm Bianca. I'm from Brazil, Salvador in Brazil. And my research, as Sílvia said, is about women who killed their abusive partners in Bahia, which is the state that I live in. This research is a part of my master's studies. I have just completed my master's this week, actually. So this is I brought some of the results of my research to talk about with you guys today. First of all, I'd like to start by saying that I work with a feminist standpoint theory, and I situate my knowledge, or I using these standpoint theories. So here I reinforce that the feminist studies involve a commitment to a social and political project for social transformation and to the postulation of an alternative theory of knowledge. And I also use the knowledge of Sandra Harding to localize my production and declare my interests and motives and intentions so that it can be possible to legitimate my research through a strong objectivity. I think the slides are kind of on and off, but I think it's okay. If you need me to change, I just let me know. Okay. So in terms of method, I selected cases in the feminine penitentiary here, so feminine prison, and I selected through the prison files of the inmates 16 cases that could be related to the object of my research, so cases of women who had killed abusive partners, and I decided to go with qualitative research and used only 4 of these cases to analyze. I did semi-structured interviews with 3 of the women that I talk about here, and also analyzed the case records, their files, and also got to see the trial of one of them, which is the 4th woman that I couldn't really interview directly, but I got to see her trial. My goal was to understand these women's contacts with the criminal justice system, and also to see what is the relation between the state's action or omission and the use of self-defense by battered women. I'd like to point out that today I'm talking more sensibly about the women's contact with the criminal justice system, but it will lead up to the relations about the state. So yeah. First, I'd like to bring Franciele, which is one of the women that I interviewed. And she is a female, a Black woman, heterosexual. Oh, sorry, this isn't working. Okay, I'll just keep going without the presentation, okay?
You have to select another window to share if you want, Bianca.
Yeah,
so you cannot share the same.
It's not showing anymore, my window here, although it is open. So, oh, it is again. Okay.
You have to share it again.
Okay, there it is.
Yes.
I'm not sure.
Okay. Yes, it is.
Thank you. Sorry about that, guys. So Franciele is a Black woman, and she's currently in a stable relationship that she began after the death of her aggressor. She has a 7-year-old son and is a Protestant. She was 23 years old when she was involved in her mate's death. She says that she hired a friend or colleague to scare her partner, that she didn't intend for him to die, that her only intention was to make the assault stop. So she says she still wanted to live with him and was just trying to find a way to defend herself, but not a lethal defense. So in addition to many physical, financial, and psychological violence, the partner also threatened to kill her or hire someone to kill her if she went to the police, so she never went to the police. She didn't have an adequate legal assistance in her criminal suit, so if you look at the records, it's just a big mess, and there isn't a cohesive defense thesis in her name for her. So she never even mentioned that she was a battery victim on court. She was sentenced to 20 years and 8 months in prison. I brought some of the quotes that she said when we were talking, and she talks about, she says, I was 14 years old when I met him. We spent about 8 years together. At the beginning, it was like that, right? Everything was sweet. The problem started when I got pregnant with my son. Now he's 7 years old. When I got pregnant, he didn't accept the pregnancy at all. He wanted me to get rid of it. When I asked her about why didn't she go to the police or why she didn't seek for institutional help, she mentioned that when I spoke to him like this, I'm going to the police station. Did you forget that there are police stations? I know where they are. And then he said, go then, but you know that I will get back at you. If I don't do it, I'll send someone to do it. And she says her mistake was not to press charges. And unfortunately, when we're in a situation like this, only those who pass situations like this are the ones who really know how desperate we get. Then we always go for the easy way. The easy way is the one that brings you here. I think it's very strong that she puts it in this way, that she says that the easy way is the way that gets you to prison. So for these women, it was easier to, as in, there were less obstacles to arrange for her husband to die or to get assaulted, to stop assaulting her, than it was to seek institutional help. So I think that says a lot of what the state has been offering as alternative for these women. The next day, the police arrived. The next day after her partner died, but I never confirmed that it was me because my family does not have the financial resources to be able to supply the need of a lawyer. So my mistake was also that I didn't get help from a lawyer to be on my jury. Even when I was heard at the police station, I didn't have any assistance from a lawyer. the teenager, which is the person who actually killed her husband. When he got to the police station, he said that she killed him and that she did it for money. And the narrative in her criminal records is all constructed in that way, that she wanted money when she killed him. The other participant is Maria Esperança. These names, she picked this name for herself. It wasn't my choice. So that's also very symbolic. She is also a Black woman, heterosexual and single. She never finished high school, has 3 children, and is a Catholic. She worked as a hairdresser, and she was 26 years old when she killed her companion. The Self-Defense Act happened when they were having an argument, and she had tried to leave the relationship many times, and she shot her partner with a homemade weapon that was actually his weapon in his house. And she also mentioned that it took a long time for her to actually be trialed, so around 7 years. And by that time, she was already married to someone else and had a baby, and it was very, very hard for her to be convicted after such a long time. And she also never went to the police because her companion always threatened to kill her, and also and her family if she sought institutional help. When asked about the violence, she told me that she said, he beat me, tried to kill me with a knife. There were so many attacks. I tried to run away, but if I ran away somewhere, then what would happen to my family? He even threatened my family. If you do this, if you leave me, I will kill you. If you leave, I will end your family. I will kill everyone, your sister, everyone will be dead too. It is so embarrassing. She paused and cried a lot during the interview. And she also said, I had never been in jail. It is very difficult. When I asked her about breaking up with him or seeking institutional help, she mentioned that he didn't accept it at all. He always said, oh, so what are you thinking? If I kill you, it will come to nothing. Justice, it doesn't exist for men. Justice for men does not exist. I will kill you, then what? You'll just be another statistic. That's what he used to tell her. I also asked her about her jury trial and what happened and how was that experience. And she mentioned that the whole case was that the prosecutor, in addition to being prejudiced about her hair, also called her a prostitute. And he would say that, oh, look at her, a woman like this, she has this red hair. You only need to look at her and you'll see that she's very dangerous to society. And so she says he made a huge deal about her hair, and that as she was crying and her family was crying, and it was very hard for her to go through that event. She was convicted to 14 years in prison, and she's still in prison. The third woman that I interviewed is Lelia. This name I got to pick because she didn't want to pick her own name, so I picked one for her. She's a heterosexual Black woman. She's single. She never finished middle school, is a Catholic, and has no children. She was 35 when she killed her companion. That happened during an argument when he caused a really serious injury to her leg and threatened to kill her. So she stabbed him. She called the police in some of the attacks, but the place where they lived was not accessible to cars, and it was very hard for her to talk about, to actually get to the police. So when they came, they only stayed in a further street that she had to actually get out of the house and go to them to call them physically. And she didn't do that. She didn't have the courage to do that, obviously, for obvious reasons, because that would put her in great risk. Currently, she's out of prison and awaiting trial. When asked about the violence, she said it was a very troubled relationship, that he was always drugged and he used drugs. He beat me a lot. He fought with his mother. He wanted me to get money for him to buy drugs. He was very troubled. He cursed me. He beat me. I have scars on my face, on my hand. The last one, he threw a marble stone when I passed before it happened, the death that she means. She says she called the cops a couple times, as I explained before. She verbally affirms that it was self-defense, and that her family also testified, that his family, also testified, and that everyone said that he beat her a lot. And she claims she just defended herself. The last woman was the one that I didn't get to interview. She was 64 years old when she went to trial, but she was 57 when she killed her companion. So they were together for 20 years, and she reported constant and violence throughout their relationship, especially sexual violence. She set him on fire. That's how she killed him, after being raped. She never reported the situations of violence, and she was very afraid of retaliation. She was acquitted by the jury, so this was a very, very rich experience, as I got to watch the trial taking place, even though I didn't get to interview her directly. On trial, she said that it was a disturbed, abusive relationship, that he called her stupid, and among other awful names that you can read here. She always said that he would say to her, "Don't you want to sleep with me anymore? Oh, I will catch you. I will catch you. I'm going to kill you." She also said that he attacked her. He pulled knives at her. And she mentioned she left the house several times, but she was afraid to go to the police. The judge asked her why she never went to the police, and she mentioned she feared that he would get back at her and it would be even worse violent reaction. I'll get to the end of it. Thank you. So what I wanted to show with my research, or to investigate, was, first of all, talk about the micropolitics of marital violence, especially considering intersectionality as a category to understanding violence, and also the practice of self-defense as it modulates and calibrates the ways that women seek for help. I also wanted to contest the learned helplessness theory, which is commonly used to defend these women in court, especially not exactly by offering an alternative just yet as a defensive theory, but mainly to provoke the thought that maybe, and for me this is very clear, what happens to these women isn't exactly a psychological condition. Not that there isn't psychological damage, obviously, as a result of many years of violence, but most importantly, I believe the state does not offer enough assistance to these women, and it is a very reasonable, not an insane thought to have, that you need to do this on your own. You need to actually fend for yourself. I argue that this is a reasonable conclusion that sane people assume that this is the only way to survive. The criminal justice system still is the main tool offered by the state to aid battered women, and statistics have already shown the inadequacy of this approach, considering that it had very little effect in women mortality here in Brazil, and it also has had a low impact in actual sentencing and conviction of aggressors. So we know from previous research that the criminal justice system isn't interested in protecting women. It is much more interested in targeting certain social groups, specifically Black communities here in Brazil. So we know that's the main goal of the criminal justice system. It is not to protect women. And with that, I'm not saying we should abandon law and go to a state of complete anarchy and private violence, but we should definitely start thinking about different approaches to deal with this violence, because what we have offered so far is not working as it should. So what I try to say is that pushed to the limit by the state, they were pushed to the limit by the state, not by mental illness. And I point to the distrust in the public interest and capability of resolving their problem and actually guaranteeing their safety as the main reason for them to not seek institutional help. So that's it. We can talk more if you have any questions. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for the trouble.
No trouble at all. Thank you so much, Bianca. So I will pull all the 4 presenters up so we can have a deeper. And we have on the comment sessions a question for Riddhi. So, Riddhi, repercussions for authors, publishers upon publishing community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Carolina. I mean, this is an interesting question because I did an interview with the publisher and he certainly sort of expressed, I would not say he sort of expressed some particular incident of intimidation of any form, but he did express pride in the fact that his publishing house sort of dared to, publish this genre and these forms of writings, and these writings particularly, which often end up highlighting a lot of violence by the state and a lot of sort of, lack of governance and lack of facilities by the state, a lot of corruption as well. So he certainly expressed this pride that, okay, we have the courage to publish this truth which is not allowed to often come out that easily. But yeah, I mean, his is a progressive publishing house. He has been persecuted by the state because he's also an activist. So he has already been on the receiving end of that sort of an oppression. But yeah, but not explicitly, but yes, it's sort of implied, and people do talk about it, that not everybody is willing to publish prison writings, particularly writings which are incriminating officers of the law and the whole criminal justice system. So yeah.
Thank you, Riddhi. Another question here is for myself, and I apologize. I should have apologized before. I apologize for my presentation. I was not aware that you could only see my first slide, and I kept talking as my presentation was going, and probably I should have explained better some of the slides so you could understood it. So I'm sorry for my awful presentation, but I have a question from Carolina too, asking if there's a transition period or practice between incarceration and release. In Portugal, we have two sorts of practices. We have special visits when we are almost ending the period in prison, so we can to help the transition to the outside, so we can go home and be with our family, and we stay for 3 days to a week, and then go back to prison. So we have those temporary visits to prepare prisoners to go to the outside. And then we have what we call parole, would be the parole. So when you reach half of your time, 2/3 of your time, or 5/6 of your time if your sentence is longer than 6 years, when you reach that time, you can be released in parole. And so you go back to the community and you are in parole. What does that mean? It means that if you do something wrong during that time, you will have to go back to prison and serve the rest of your time as you were not even on the outside. So during this parole time, it was when I interviewed most of these women, well, all of these women, the ones I presented here. And so they were in this probatory period that they had to be followed by the professionals, and they felt that more that they were being controlled than helped in this transition. And the purpose of these professionals are not to control, or at least in terms of our legislation, it's not what they are supposed to be doing. They should be helping prisoners to succeed on the outside with job applications, with giving some sort of supports with their families. So they should not be just talking about, or they should not be interfering on their success on the outside. Okay, so that would be my answer. We don't have more questions. I don't know if anyone from the panel would like to make any sort of questions. I will put everyone up so we can discuss with each other. I think everyone is up now. Yes. So if you want to ask anything to Bianca, for example, or Daniela, please do so.
Well, I actually have a question for Daniela, because I studied the kind of the same topic, more or less, and I was I don't know if it's really a question or a comment, but like when I did research about the less eligibility thing, an interesting thing I found sometimes was that even like given all the criticalities that you show us, and the difficulties of getting an effective equivalence of care, there are some prisoners who, well, at least some physicians and some other healthcare professionals that say that some prisoners get more possibilities for health, more possibilities for treatment inside prison than they do outside. What do you think about this kind of I don't know, rhetoric or whatever?
Yeah, it's a rhetoric which I met many times talking with the doctors, but also nurses and other prison officers, etc. I linked this thing exactly to the less eligibility because maybe sometimes it's true that in prison there are in some cases we should make differences among prisons, territories, etc. But it's true that sometimes things go better in prison. For example, I think to the time a prisoner must wait to have an external doctor for a specific a specialist, etc. The problem is the prison condition in itself, because when we think to, for example, to wait for a visit outside, we in the meantime we can spend our time in many ways. In prison, we have the so-called amplification of the symptoms. So the waiting times, for example, are a good example. To wait 3 months inside prison is different than waiting 3 months outside prisons, however. But if from being an external entering in the prison, we can understand these things. Prison doctors, on the otherwise, are institutionalized, I think, in these aspects, and so they assume the prison culture, what I call the prison culture, which is a complex concept, obviously, and they often underline the favoritism, the favoritism, the privileged for prisoners. But the way to read this phenomena, I think, is it's complex, and that's why I agree with all the literature, the international literature, which propose a new idea of equivalence of care, not equivalence of in terms of hours a doctor spent in prison or etc., but the equivalence of the objective. So how can I really promote health in prison? But that's a big challenge, I know.
Thank you, Daniela. We have a question for Bianca. So we should definitely find better ways to address domestic violence. I'm assuming Carolina is from Brazil too. So do the women mention feeling more or less safe with the absence of the domestic abuse?
Hi.
I'm not sure what. Okay.
Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead. I was just saying that I'm not sure where this question goes, but I'll just leave it to you.
Thank you for asking. They don't, as we talked, they didn't really mention feeling relief or feeling better after the fact, which is after killing their husbands. I think they were much more involved in the trauma of suffering the violence and also of the violent act of self-defense, which is also very traumatic for all of them, most of them at least. And the experience of being incarcerated was also the most significant thing that they mentioned. So I didn't ask directly to them if they felt safer now, if this sensation of this feeling of insecurity had passed, but they didn't mention it as spontaneously either.
Okay. Thank you, Daniela. Daniela, sorry. Bianca. Okay. So we are way out of time, but we have a really big panel. So it would be possible to have everyone presenting in an hour and a half like we had on the program. I hope you all enjoyed. I, at least today. And I'm pretty sure we can continue talking among each other and share other experiences in the future. Thank you for the ones that were out there listening to us during all this time. And I'm looking forward to continue talking with all of you. Thank you so much for your presentations.
Thank you, Sílvia.
Today.
Thanks to you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.